My name is Adam Watson. I'm one of our agriculture agents here in Washington County with UT Extension. And this evening we're going to be looking at dormant pruning of berries and grapes. So we've got a lot of ground to cover. So jumping right into it, just remember as we go through this evening, if I'm making any references to commercial products or brand names, it's not intended to be discriminating against similar products I don't mention, and it's not an implied endorsement for myself or the university. And anytime I might mention anything related to pesticides, I understand nothing I say trumps the label of that pesticide. The pesticide label is the law, and we should always follow it regardless of what I say in tonight's presentation. So as I said earlier, we're going to be covering both caneberries and blueberries, and then we'll hop over and take care of grapes as well. And so let's get started into the thick of it. So when we're talking about caneberries or brambles, these are our blackberries, our raspberries. Thing to understand about them is their growth habit. They're biennial. So in a floricane fruiting caneberry, what happens is the first year growth is purely vegetative. It grows up a cane, it sets flower buds, and then the next year it will actually fruit. So it fruits in the second year cane, or what's called the floricane. There are primocane fruiting berries, and so these allow us to actually have two crops off of the same plant, because as the primocane, which is that first year cane, grows, it actually fruits late in the season. So sometimes these are called fall bearing raspberries or blackberries or everbearing because of this. And we would still get a subsequent crop on that mature 2-year-old floricane as we would normally expect from these berries. So just understand there are two different main types out there, and we do look at those a little bit differently. The other thing to understand is we will see a little bit of different growth habits. We can have erect, semi-erect, or trailing caneberries. And so different varieties may have a different growth habit. So just because you're seeing some differences in berries in your berry yard doesn't mean that there's a problem or one of them's not growing correctly. It could be they just have different growing habits. And so just understand that as we go through this. Trellises are always highly encouraged with caneberries, helps with picking as well as any sort of task we have to do with these. So if it's pruning, if there is any sort of disease control, which honestly is pretty rare for these berries, it just makes it easier to have a more upright plant and allows us to have better use of the space. And so you'll see here a few different types of trellises that you can devise for your home berries, and all of them work well. So it's worth mentioning, because we do plant in the dormant season, that we do actually want to prune these as we plant them. So ordinarily when we get these as bare root plants, they may come with quite a bit of stalk attached to them, even though they've probably been cut back once just for ease of shipment. What we want to do before we plant these out is actually prune them to just above the ground line. We just want 1 or 2 buds left. And the reason we're doing this is this first year, we want to focus the energy on establishment of that plant. We don't want to see anything that was grown there previously try to flower and produce fruit. And it just allows us to get started off on the right foot. So cutting these back when you plant them is important. If you've inherited blackberries or raspberries and you're not for sure which is which, keep in mind that with raspberries, when you harvest the fruit, the receptacle is left behind. To me, I always think of a raspberry as being thimble-like, in that if you look in the fruit, it's kind of hollow. And it's hollow because the receptacle is left behind. With blackberries, it's actually integral to the fruit. So you leave nothing behind on the plant whenever you do your actual harvest of the berry. So if you're not sure which you have, there are some differences in color and things like that, but a super easy way to tell if you've seen the berries, you should be able to know easily which one is actually a blackberry and which one's a raspberry. So when we're talking about semi-erect or erect blackberries, if this is an established planting, we're talking about, first off, if you've not already done this, and this is something you can do as you're ending the harvest season, but you can remove the dead flora canes. So those canes that fruited last year, they're dead now. They're not going to do anything else for us. And so we want to get those out of that growing area. Next thing we want to do is we want to prune our lateral branches of blackberries back to about 12 to 18 inches in length. If we have low growing laterals, so things low down on the cane itself, close to the ground, we want to look at removing those as well. So anywhere from 12 to 18 inches above the ground is where we want our laterals to start. The laterals is where we're going to have our fruiting occur. And we don't want fruit too close to the ground. We're more likely to have loss, and it's simply easier to have that fruit more elevated. We also want to thin out the canes as we look at the growing area. So weaker canes, canes that didn't grow as well, maybe started later in the season, we want to just remove those. It's better to have fewer strong canes fruiting well than to have a lot of canes that don't fruit well. Because in general terms, the fewer canes we have, the larger fruit we're going to have. Because all the energy that could have went into a half dozen canes are now going into maybe 3 or 4. And so that is how we can sort of improve the quality of our fruit, is actually by reducing the quantity or the number of berries. So we'd rather have larger berries and fewer ones than a lot of small berries. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just simply remove those canes which are themselves not in great shape. They're more weak. For black and purple raspberries, very similar. Again, dead flora canes removed. They already fruited. They're not doing anything for us. Here we're pruning our lateral branches back to 8 to 10 inches, so shorter than what we were doing with the blackberries. And again, we're thinning and removing those weaker canes for the very same reason. So basically for both of these, what we're doing is we're trying to reduce the density of plants that are there and also reduce the size of the plants so that we have fewer fruit occurring overall, but again, higher quality. When we look at red and yellow raspberries, they're a little bit different. So one of the big ones already, again, remove those dead flora canes that already fruited. On these, we can sometimes see winter injury. And so we do want to cut back any winter injury we see, cut back to live tissue on that plant. And again, thin out those canes as well as with these, because they grow more in a hedgerow, a wider growth pattern. We want to narrow that footprint too. So don't let them grow out of bounds. So again, same idea, reducing the number of canes that are present to again improve the quality of the berry. If we're talking about our primocane fruiting caneberries, again, these are ones that can do both a fall crop and then a subsequent summer crop. We can choose 2 patterns to prune these. One of those is to grow them only as a fall crop and not worry about getting the second flora cane crop the next summer, or manage them so we get both. There's not a right or wrong answer to this. Either one works. So if we're only growing for that fall crop, what we would actually do during the late dormant season is come in and cut down all the growth that's there. Literally mowing is suggested often in the home berry yard. That may or may not be the best approach. Certainly hand pruners work well, but actually just completely physically removing that crop is what we would do. Because again, what we are getting our crop off of in primocanes, if we're only managing for the fall crop, is on the primocane. So when it regrows in the spring, grows throughout summer, and then fruits in the fall, we don't need anything to carry over because we're only worried about that fall crop. And so in this case, we would actually just manage these by mowing them down in the dormant season. And so this can sometimes be a good way if you're worried about diseases or things like that. That's one advantage to this, in that you only have a 1-year-old plant. You're not carrying it over to that second year. And that sometimes can reduce the opportunities for disease. If we are managing for both the primocane crop, so the fall crop, and the subsequent floricane crop, in that case, when the primocanes are actually done fruiting, in the dormant season, what we're going to come back and do is one, remove the dead tips. Because where they actually bear the fruit on that primocane is actually going to die back once they're finished with the fruit season. So in the dormant season, we come in, remove those dead tips back to living plant material, and then we're going to subsequently thin those canes again. So the same thing we saw with the others. We still want to decrease the density. If we have unthrifty canes, remove those. And so this dormant season pruning is more similar to what we do for our standard floricane fruiting berries. And again, there's not a right or wrong way to manage these. Most people do see decent crops on the subsequent floricanes. So you do have the option either way you choose. When we shift gears to looking at dormant pruning of blueberries, we handle them, of course, completely different than we do caneberries. And it's because we have long-lived woody plants, not something that is limited to just a 2-year lifespan. So obviously there's going to be some differences. Again, we'll start at the dormant season pruning of a new planting. If you have bare root plants, basically what you want to do is head back the younger, more upright canes to 8 to 12 inches tall, prune off older, lower shoots, because we don't want those older shoots there trying to bloom and produce berries. If you have a container grown plant, basically we do the same thing with one addition. And that one addition would be really take a close look at the root system. It's not uncommon for containerized blueberries to have a really overgrown or matted root system, or roots that are circling in the container. And if we have that, we do want to correct it as best we can. And so that means that it may just be physically uncurling those roots some, depending to the severity of it, but it also can be actually slicing through that root ball to prevent those roots from continuing circling. Because what happens when we put woody plants that have circling roots in containers into the ground, we end up with roots that continue to circle. And oftentimes, if they don't want to actually grow out into the surrounding soil, they can become girdling and actually kind of squeezing on the plant itself over time. And so root pruning is really important if we have an overgrown or a circling root system in a container grown plant. If we're having to do a lot of cutting on that root system, then we may want to really think about cutting back increasing the top pruning more to reduce the amount of plant material that we're asking that reduced root system to support. So just understand, make sure you pay attention to the root system on containerized plants, and if need be, reduce the size of what you leave to balance out root loss. We don't want fruiting happening on the first couple of years with blueberry plants. We basically want these plants to establish themselves with vegetative growth and not worry about expending resources on flowers. It will absolutely reduce future yields and harvest if you try to have berries early on. So even if you're buying a 2-year-old plant or 3-year-old plant, you still want to not crop those first couple of years they're in the ground at your own berry yard, because it's going to reduce future opportunities for harvest. What you find when you look at blueberries, floral buds are actually at the tips or at the ends of branches. And so they are larger, plumper, more round than vegetative buds, which are found below them. And so we can actually either prune these out or rub these out as they begin to grow in the spring, because we don't want to leave these on the plant. Just to reinforce where we find those flower buds, if you look on flowering blueberries, you will find those flowers are at the tips. So what do we do in subsequent dormant years after planting? So one thing we want to do and make sure we do a good job with is heading back vigorous young canes. So when we have vigorous young canes, depicted here in this graphic with the number 3. We want to head those back, which means reducing their height to 4 to 6 inches below the rest of the bush. And what that's going to do is encourage them to produce good, strong laterals. And those laterals will have more fruit than a single branch that's growing straight up. The other thing we want to make sure we're doing is, of course, removing those floral buds on the tips, but we also want to prune off any weak and low-growing shoots. So you can see from the before and the after picture, you're basically opening that plant up, thinning out growth that is less robust so that you're left with a more open plant and stronger growth. And we basically do that for the first 2 years we have it in the ground. In the third dormant pruning, we still kind of do the same basic process, which a little bit added into it. And so again, we remove the weak and low-growing shoots. Again, they're going to be problematic for harvest. They're going to be more likely to become disease, so we remove those. We would actually want to be thinning out the oldest canes that we have in that bush. We would like to remove maybe 20% each year after it's about 3 to 4 years old. Typically, what you'll see is a difference in bark appearance, and you'll see a lot more horizontal growth to the plant. And I'll show you some pictures in a moment to demonstrate this. And then the other thing we still want to make sure we're doing is to reduce the very vigorous canes again, 4 to 6 inches below the height of the canopy, to encourage lateral growth on those younger, more vigorous parts. The reason we're concerned about pruning out those oldest branches is because even at year 3, we'll start seeing smaller berries produced on these plants. Smaller berries take more time to harvest, and by and large, we'd much rather have larger berries. And so they're smaller, and overall, it's a reduced harvest. So what am I talking about? So here's a graphic I borrowed from North Carolina State University that dramatically demonstrates this. And so on the left, you see a year 1 branch growing, and what you see is there aren't laterals. Year 2, we see these laterals have developed, but what happens in year 3, suddenly our laterals get laterals. And as this happens, what this means is we get smaller and smaller berry sizes. And so the most productive are going to be the 1 and 2 year old wood that we see there on the left and middle. And the least productive for us is actually going to be the 3-year-old and older branches that we're finding in the bushes. And so if you look at this picture, you can see there's a difference in bark color. This isn't the greatest, this was taken from a video, this isn't the greatest quality of photo, but even with a poor photograph, you'll see certainly better in real life a difference in the bark composition and color. And so those older branches will not yield as well as the younger ones do. Just another graphic way to depict this, when we have a stem or branch that's growing, in that first summer, it's growing, it's also setting its floral buds. Then in the dormant year, you basically in January have that stem with those dormant buds, and then when it fruits, you have those berries there at the end like we would expect. That same stem, if we follow it through to year 2 of fruiting, we have laterals developing in the summer after the first harvest. Those laterals is what's going to fruit the next year. And so, again, with these laterals, very acceptable berry size. But in that third year is where we have the laterals producing laterals. And that's where we start getting to smaller berries and production drops. It's just the nature of so many berries are taxing. And we'd rather have fewer berries that are larger. So again, the oldest materials are going to be what we want to remove out selectively from blueberry plants. It's not unusual that we do have plants that may have been slightly neglected when it comes to blueberries. And a lot of times people are intimidated about going in and pruning. With most fruit pruning, I think the general rule in my mind is people prune too little, not too much. And so we can go into a blueberry that hasn't been pruned as much as perhaps it should have and start removing out those oldest stems, anything that has damage. Again, the same basics, the low growing, the weak shoots, etc. We can start bringing those bushes back to what they need to be. And certainly part of that is removing those oldest canes that are in there, those oldest stems, to improve light as well as air penetration. That also helps us with berry quality from a standpoint of reducing wetness. If we are in a scenario where we just really have a poorly performing plant, we can do what you see there on the left, which is basically rejuvenation pruning. And so for like a rabbit eye variety, we would leave a 6 to 8 inch stub and remove everything else. And then as that regrows, we would shape that architecture the way we want it. The good thing about doing this is if it's a healthy bush otherwise, maybe just unmanaged, you're going to see a lot of growth rapidly. So it's actually going to grow back quickly. The high bush is similar, but rather than leaving a 6 to 10 inch or 12 inch stub, we're actually going to cut it back basically to ground level. In this case, what we're actually wanting is to get a root sucker to pop off that plant. And then that's what we would use to reform the plant. And so these are options if you have grossly unmanaged plants. This might be faster than trying to just correctively prune it back to where it should be. The other thing to mention is that if it's not just a pruning issue, a lack of attention, if we have a lot of disease happening or things like that, truthfully, it may be better just to start over with a new plant rather than trying to salvage something that has a lot of problems. And so there are times when something may just be past the point of assistance. And so you do want to consider that before you invest your time and effort into corrective pruning. I'm not seeing any questions. Okay, we do have one. So is it appropriate to fertilize blueberry plants? It is. So the number one thing when it comes to soil and blueberries is our pH where it needs to be. pH influences the availability of nutrients, and we know, or most folks know, blueberries need to be low pH. So that's always our first concern. But absolutely, fertilizing fruit crops is something you should consider if you're not doing it at all. It's not necessarily that they're heavy feeders, but the reality is every time we take a harvest off of a plant, we're removing nutrients from its environment. And so while there are levels in the soil that may allow us to do that for a certain amount of time, it is certainly better to keep replacing those rather than always having it go out rather than returning anything. So certainly fertilizing blueberries and actually any of our fruit is advised. We've got some resources associated with that will be sent out to everybody that registered for this presentation this evening. Those won't get sent out till Friday because I'm actually in Knoxville tomorrow. But absolutely, we do want to be fertilizing our fruit, especially when we're doing harvest off of those, because we are removing those nutrients. So that's a great question. Not going to spend a lot of time on this, but there's a lot of specific words we can use when it comes to pruning terms and grapes. I'll use some of these this evening, and I'll try to be consistent so that we keep on track. I'm also just going to describe some things as what they are because it's a little bit easier than always using the correct proper word. But certainly, if you do have grapes, I would definitely refer you to the resources. We have several good publications from universities around the U.S. that are great when it comes to pruning grapes. So one thing I'll mention about pruning grapes can look very complicated, and it can be, and especially in a commercial setting. It's not uncommon when you start looking through the resources for pruning grapes, you start seeing about counting buds and the weight of the trimmings that are removed and things like that. This evening does not take that approach. We take a much more practical approach to this, and we're not really worried about those fine details. Those details are available to you through the resources, but for the average backyard vineyard, I don't think we need to go to that specificity normally. Certainly, if you're looking at absolutely maximizing production, that's where you would start to concentrate more on those. But if you're just wanting good harvest and reliable harvest, I think what we covered tonight will be sufficient. One thing to understand about grapes, when we start pruning them, that is going to encourage them to actually break bud or start growing. It stimulates their growing. So to that end, we want to prune these later in the year than we do some of our tree fruits or even our berries. And so just understand that pruning on grapes does stimulate bud break. So if we do it too early, we are possibly subjecting them to a late spring frost. So what we want to do is do it before we start having bud break. And there in the right picture, you actually see the bud breaks where it's starting to grow. We want to do it before that. And so I would not rush out and prune my grapes this weekend, even if we have beautiful weather, which I'm not sure we're going to. Haven't looked at the forecast, honestly. But don't be too early with this. So give it some time. These buds will actually start swelling before they start actually breaking. And so if you're seeing that, it's a good time to do it. But we still got time definitely into March before I'd worry about pruning these grapes. I found this statement, and I would agree 100% it's true. Home grape owners don't typically prune their vines enough. And the reality is when it comes to looking at grapes, 90% of what grew last year is pruned off. There's very little retained. And the whole reason by this is ask yourself the one question: where does fruiting occur? On a lot of our fruits, we're talking about the fruit buds are formed the prior year. We preserve those into the next spring, and then we get production. With grapes, all the growth or all the fruiting appears on new growth that happens in the spring. So that's why we can remove 90% of last year's growth, and we're not hurting ourselves. We're not hurting the harvest. But this is also how very quickly, if we don't pay attention to grapes, if we don't do proper pruning, they get out of hand in a hurry because we're leaving 10% or even less of that plant behind. So if you're leaving 100% for a couple of years in a row, you have a really overgrown plant that's not going to perform well for us. So just understand with grapes especially, it is more likely you're pruning too little rather than too much. And so depending how you want to prune, this is kind of the final look you're going to see. With this, this is actually and we'll get to this in a moment, but this is a spur prune or cordon pruned grape. You have basically shoots coming off at a density about 4 shoots per foot. That can vary depending on the exact type of grape you're growing. And sometimes you've got to go in and thin these out even after you've done your initial pruning. But this is kind of like the goal we're shooting for. And what you'll notice, the brown branches that you see there, those brown vines were last year's or older. And the new green growth is actually where we're going to have our harvest from. So again, just reinforcing new growth is where we get the harvest from. There's 2 big systems that we look at when pruning grapes: cane pruning and spur pruning. Spur pruning is where we have cordons established. Cordons are just our horizontal vines that are permanently established on our trellis. And so this is more common for wine grapes, but not every variety of wine grape. There are some that do better with cane pruning. And basically, if we're describing it, basically every year you're cutting all the canes short to rejuvenate them. So there's more cuts, but you're removing a lot of material overall. Cane pruning, more common for like our Concord and American varieties or the American Finch hybrids. With this, we actually do leave some long canes, but they're renewed every year. So we don't have permanently established cordons or horizontals because every single year we're rejuvenating them. We actually have fewer cuts overall, but again, we're removing a lot of material. Truth is, any grape can be grown under either system. There might be a yield factor where one variety performs better under one system than the other. But literally, any grape can be grown under either pruning system. Again, talking about planting, bare root grapes in the dormant season at planting, we reduce those basically to a single shoot with 3 buds. Because again, what we're trying to do is establish a trunk with a newly planted grape. And what we want to do is have our trellising in place, and as it grows, hopefully we're able to tie it up to the bottom horizontal of our trellis. There are scenarios where if it doesn't work out well, we can actually start again, basically make the same sort of pruning cut the subsequent season, but we've lost a year. But it's very important. So, if we have a lousy trunk growing, it's worth giving yourself another year to grow a trunk, because a sound trunk is very important. If you don't have a sound trunk, you don't have a grape that has longevity. So it is important. Basically, if it's your first dormant pruning after planting, you've got a couple of scenarios that could be happening, and we're assuming that it's grown well. So you might just have a trunk that just reaches or slightly taller than the bottom wire. In that case, just tie the trunk to the bottom wire and remove the top bud and remove any laterals. Another possibility is we have a vigorous trunk grows above that bottom wire. If that happens, we want to cut it to 4 or 5 buds above the wire and bend it down to the wire and tie those there. And we remove laterals. If we have a trunk that's extremely well-growing and vigorous, we may have a lot of side branches above and below. What we can do is take the 2 closest laterals to a horizontal wire, cut those to 3 to 5 buds, and tie them to that bottom wire. And so to demonstrate that here, we have basically, again, the somewhat well-growing where it does reach the wire. We've got one where it's overgrowing the wire. And then lastly, we have the one where we have quite a bit of growth. And so what we're trying to do with our first dormant pruning after planting season is just establish that trunk well. And depending on how much growth is there, we may be able to go ahead and start establishing those horizontal branches. When we go into that next year dormant pruning, what we're looking for with cane pruning are canes that are well formed, 3 to 5 foot in length, and we want diameters that are slightly larger than a pencil, anywhere from about 1/3 of an inch up to 3/8 of an inch in diameter. Those can be used to establish those horizontals. And again, we want to be tying our canes to the trellis. It helps train them to grow well because we like upright growth. So again, coming back to the 2 systems, cane pruning and spur pruning. So here are the 2 different systems depicted, one next to the other. What you'll notice is basically the big difference. The horizontals on spur pruning on the right are permanent, and on the left, they're renewed every single pruning season. That's the difference. And so because of that, with cane pruning, where we're renewing those horizontals every year, when it comes time to come in and do a dormant pruning on an established plant, what we do is we cut out the horizontals that were there last year. That's going to be a large amount of growth we're removing. Because remember, when we were finished last year, all we had were horizontals on that bottom wire and a few little nubs. And so we're removing all that other growth. And what we're left here in this picture, we actually have 3 potential horizontals. You're going to pick 2 of those. And from those, you pick 2 and you attach them to the wire. So what you're doing is you're establishing those horizontals newly each year. If you look closely at this picture, let me see if I can grab my laser pointer. You look closely here on the screen, what you'll see are some little nubs left behind. That's intentional. Because what's going to happen, those are going to produce long growing laterals that next year you'll select the new horizontals from. So each year you have 3 to 4 shortened renewal spurs that you allow to grow that are going to produce next year's horizontal. And you choose the best 2 from those to establish the next year's horizontal. This particular picture is where they've done a double trunk on a grape. There's both single trunk and double trunks. And so don't let that throw you. Even if this were a single trunk, we would still have the same practices happen. With a spur type grape, what we're looking at doing is basically just pruning back what grew last year to the permanent branching. And so each year what we do is we remove all of last year's growth and leave just a few buds on these spurs. These spurs are where all the growth is going to come from. And as this grapevine gets older, they're going to become larger and more gnarly looking, and that's okay. This is a fairly young grapevine. But basically with this one, we have our permanently established horizontals that we do not remove. And again, that's the big difference between spur pruning and cane pruning. Again, think about the picture, what we're seeing. In this particular example, you have relatively old spurs that are still fruiting well. We see here, hey, we've got a problem. We've got a loss of a spur that didn't produce anything this year. There are ways to fix that, and I'll talk about it in a minute. But again, the big difference, we have a multi-year-old horizontal, and here we have a 2-year-old horizontal. And it gets renewed every year. So one of these uprights that's larger, more vigorous, will become next year's horizontal. We can, in the circumstances where we have a part of a cordon or a established spur pruning branch that's not producing. So here you notice we have no upright growth on this from the past season, so no production. So what we can do is what we would do ordinarily for a cane pruning, and that's basically just rejuvenate it by removing all the old material and establishing a new horizontal. And so all that's going to do is we're fixing that problem where we have a lack of production here, and we're going to renew that with a new horizontal branch. Because remember, I told you earlier, spruce or cane pruning can be used for either type of grape. Basically, it doesn't matter. You might affect your yield, but either one is appropriate for any grape that we're growing. And so because of that, when needed, if we need to renew a plant, need to fix a production problem, we can do that. Even if it's a spur prune grape, for one season, treating it as if it were cane prune. So to show this a little bit in action and kind of as a recap of everything I just said, I do have a clip of a video from Penn State. I think the clip I have for you is less than 3 minutes. Let's see here. Get rid of my laser pruner. There. So this would just be a short clip. Hopefully that put maybe into better practice than just my words did for you. Well, too far. So I mentioned earlier that everybody that signed up for the class will get a resource document that has all the resources associated with this I think you'd be interested in. Also has tree fruit resources as well. But you can access this tonight. With that, I will say thank you all for joining us this evening. Be on the lookout for the other classes we've already got scheduled and others we'll be doing this spring. And again, in that survey is a great place to tell me what classes you would like us to do most. And so that's a great place for me to pull new ideas from. And so I'll just say thank you and everybody have a good evening.